Okay, so we are going to get started. If everybody wants to take a seat, we'll just wait a second here while everybody comes and sits down. Before we get started, I just want to let you guys know my name's Jennifer Dixon. I'm the Air Quality Liaison with EGLE, and I'm going to be playing a couple roles here tonight for the public meeting. I'm going to facilitate the beginning part, and then I'm going to be the hearings officer when we do the formal hearing. So we're going to talk a little bit about the different things that we're going to do tonight. So hopefully you're all here because we're going to be talking about primarily the consent order for Viant. That's what the hearing part is about. But we're also going to be giving you some updates on the other things that are going on with the facility and the enforcement action against them. So the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to have Jeff Rathlin come up, and he's going to give an update kind of on the overview, or I'm sorry, Chris Etheridge come up. Sorry, Chris. You're Chris, raise your hand. We're going to have Chris come up and give you an update on what's been going on with the company in general, ethylene oxide, some of the sampling and things like that. He'll get into that a little bit more. Then I'm going to have Laura Avington come up. She's from Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. She's going to be talking to you all about the cancer incidence review that was done in the community, and she'll give you a lot of details on that. Then Jeff's going to come up, and it's going to be a little bit of switching gears. He's going to talk about the draft consent order, which is the primary reason for the hearing today. So as we get started, you should have registered outside, and you should have gotten a colored card and a white card. So these are going to be for two different things, and I'll remind you of this later because it might be a little bit confusing. The colored cards are for you to write down any questions that you have to be asked during the question and answer portion of the night. So what we're going to do with those is once we get to the question and answer part, which will be right after the presentations, I'll have staff going around the room to collect these from you, and then I will read your questions and have the panel members answer them. If you'd like to ask a question verbally and not write it down, that's totally fine too, but we're going to do the written questions first. So just want you to know that if you have more than one question, you can get more than one card. We're not limited on anything, except we do need to start the formal hearing at 7:30 today. This white card, I'll hold it right side up. This is if you want to make a formal comment on the record. So during the comment period, which starts at 7:30, you're going to just fill out this card, mark that you would like to make a comment. Again, we'll collect these cards. Those comments will go on the record. So the panel members will leave. Myself and the decision maker will sit at the table and we'll just take your comments. So just keep in mind that the formal comment period is not a time when we will respond to anything that you say. You're just going to be speaking for the record, and that should focus on information that's in that draft consent order. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but I just wanted to give you a preview so you knew why we forced you to take two different cards tonight. So after Jeff talks about the consent order and gives you some information on that, then we'll open up that question and answer period. Again, that will end, and we'll get started with the formal hearing right at 7:30. And then after the formal hearing, or if we don't have a lot of comments for the record, we will go back to answering your questions if we still have time before 9 o'clock. We'll have staff outside for the entire time to answer questions if you feel more comfortable having a one-on-one conversation. So there's a lot of opportunities for engagement tonight, so I hope you guys take advantage of them. So with that, I'm going to have Chris come up here and do his little portion.
Good evening, everyone. Again, my name is Chris Etheridge. I'm with the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy Air Quality Division. I'm the Field Operations Manager for the Air Quality Division. I have oversight of all the field offices in the state. I'd like to thank all of you for coming tonight, taking some time out of your busy schedule to hear about this. I know you're all very interested to hear about our updates since the last meeting in March. I do recognize some faces from that meeting as well. So I'm going to start off with a brief update from the last meeting, summary of what happened there to fill in anyone that wasn't at the last meeting, and then go into some of the things we've been working on since. So how did this all start? Viant Medical is a medical sterilizer here in Grand Rapids. They are a facility that's required to report toxic emissions both to the state and to the EPA. As a result of emissions reports that they submitted back in 2014, they came up on a list called our NATA report, which is the National Air Toxics Assessment Report. Viant Medical was the #1 source of concern on that NATA report. We received that report in August of 2018. Now, there's a lot of reasons why that occurred, and we'll get into some of the specifics related to our reevaluation of ethylene oxide. But essentially, what has occurred was a reevaluation of the toxicity of ethylene oxide and human exposure to it. So based upon some medical information and reviews, studies that were done of people that have been exposed to ethylene oxide, our health-based screening levels were revised, changed, and significantly reduced. And as a result of that, Viant became the #1 source of concern on our NATA list. So this report came out in August of 2018, and we obviously took notice. We began our investigation to get into the particulars of what was going on at the facility, try to assess the situation, and get a lot more details as part of our investigation. So one of the first things we started with was doing some on-site inspections. We do have dedicated field staff in our Grand Rapids District Office that inspect Viant on a regular basis. One of the interesting things that we did was a little different from our normal inspection is we brought along some of our modeling folks on this inspection after we saw the report in August of 2018. Now, modeling staff are essentially staff in our Lansing office that use some pretty high-powered computers, and they're able to assess off-site concentrations of certain pollutants based upon a lot of variables that they look at, such as meteorological data, exit points from the facility, and the amount of emissions that are coming out of the processes there. So our field staff and our modeler went out to Viant after we saw this facility on the NATA report, and we did a full site inspection to review a lot of the particulars that we needed to use to calculate our modeling analysis. The modeling analysis that was done for Viant did show some significant concerns off-site as far as the concentration of ethylene oxide, particularly in the surrounding residential areas. So that was of concern, of course. In addition to doing this modeling analysis, we've also been able to document violations at the facility. Viant Medical is subject to both state and federal air regulations, and as a result of our inspections at the facility, we cited them for several violations, both federal and state, based upon our inspection and looking at the emissions from the facility. So there was documented non-compliance issues at the facility. In addition to all of that, we decided we would do an initial air sampling study around the facility to get some real-time analysis and some accurate numbers to show what was the concentration of ethylene oxide off-site. So the picture you see on this slide, this is called a Summa canister. This is the instrument that we used as part of our what I'll call phase 1 sampling, which was the initial sampling study that we did. We deployed 5 Summa canisters in and around the facility to capture over a 24-hour period what was the concentration of ethylene oxide, both on the facility property and then right at the property line. And there's a slide that I'll go through a little bit later that kind of shows the particulars there. And I would point out there are maps outside in the lobby as well that have showed analysis for all the sampling we've done at the facility. The air sampling we did with these Summa canisters again showed significant ethylene oxide concentrations off-site above health screening levels. So because of all of those reasons in our investigation, we felt compelled to be able to notify the community of what we were doing. So I'm sure most of you will remember there was a press release that we sent out kind of briefly, high level, summarizing the investigation we had done and our findings so far, and that led to the March 2019 meeting. So what has occurred since that meeting in March? Well, as I mentioned before, there's been several noncompliance issues that we documented from the facility. As a result of those violations, we decided to do something which is called escalated enforcement on the facility. Essentially what that means is we're going to be negotiating out an enforcement contract with the facility to resolve the documented violations. Jeff Rathlin is from our enforcement group, and he's going to go into a lot of the particulars that we've been working on related to that. But essentially what that enforcement agreement does is it resolves the violations that we documented with the facility and spells out a lot of particular items that the company needs to follow to ensure that they're following the rules and regs. And it's no secret, I'm sure most of you have heard, one of the things the company has committed to doing is ceasing medical sterilization by the end of this year. In addition, since our March 2019 meeting, we've also done some phase 2 Summa canister sampling. This was a much more comprehensive study. We used over 20 Summa canisters for our phase 2 sampling. Again, there's a map I'll go through in a minute here on another slide. But we took measurements both upwind and downwind of the facility, really tried to choose points where we would expect to find the highest impacts. But this was meant to be a much more comprehensive analysis to try to determine what was the levels of ETO off-site. In addition, EGLE staff have been working closely with our state and county health departments to assist on any public health concerns related to the ETO from this facility. So the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services has put together a cancer incident data review, which was released recently, and Laura is going to be speaking on that in a little bit here as well. So again, working closely with them to try to address any public health concerns related to the facility. Also, additional sampling has been going on. As part of our enforcement negotiations, the company did commit to doing a monthly sample while they continue to use their medical sterilizers at the facility. So there's been some additional sampling that the company's been doing in conjunction with EGLE staff as well. We call it co-locating, where we essentially will put a Summa canister next to the company's Summa canister to ensure QA/QC is guaranteed and that we're seeing the same levels that they're seeing on their Summa canisters. So again, there's a map out there documenting that, and I will go through that on one of the slides here. Okay, so here is a map showing what the phase 1 sampling results were. This was from November of last year. These numbers are in a measurement which is basically micrograms per cubic meter. That is the way we evaluate the concentrations of ethylene oxide in ambient air, and then we're comparing that to our health screening levels. You'll see the highest number is 76 micrograms per cubic meter. That was directly next to a vent at the facility. So we expected to see higher numbers there, which was in fact the case. But I would point out there is one Summa canister, canister number 4, which was at the property line, which is really where our regulations kick in. And that's what we're using as our assessment. Is the facility meeting the health screening levels? Summa canister number 4 is 0.42 micrograms per cubic meter, which is still very much above the accepted health screening level for ethylene oxide. So the phase 2 sampling occurred in March of this year, and you'll see numerous points that were used not only directly around the facility, but then also further out into the community, throughout Grand Rapids, essentially, both upwind and downwind of the facility. And you'll see every one of these Summa canister results is showing numbers that are above the accepted health screening levels for ethylene oxide. I'll get into this in another slide a little bit further along in my presentation, but Viant is just one facility that is being looked at across the nation for ethylene oxide concerns. There is a nationwide effort that's being coordinated with the US EPA and other states that have similar facilities. And we've been sharing our data with them and also looking at the data from other states. And it is interesting, and I'll point this out in a minute, I'll explain it a little bit more, but even for Summa canisters that aren't nearby medical sterilizers, we're seeing numbers that are above health screening levels. And I'll get to the why in a minute on that. So again, these are just showing some of the numbers. Summa canister number 2 here, which is circled, was the highest number we saw in our phase 2 sampling, and this was directly down one of the facility, but again, off-site, off the property. And we expected this would be the highest impact Summa canister, which was in fact the case. So as I mentioned before, as part of the enforcement negotiations with the company, Viant has committed to doing their own sampling, and they've been doing that on a monthly basis for the past few months. So this is just a picture showing one of the company's Summa canisters as well as our co-located canister next to them. And again, it's showing pretty similar numbers to what we saw in our phase 1 and phase 2 sampling. And so these are the different points that were used as part of the company's monitoring. And I believe this is for July and August. Yeah, July and August of 2019. We have just received data for September. We're still in the midst of reviewing all of that, so that should be available soon on our website. And I would mention that all of this information is on the EGLE website dedicated to our Viant investigation. So if you want to read up on any more of this after tonight's meeting, I would really encourage you to go and look at the website. There's a lot of good information on there. But again, you're seeing there's very similar numbers to what we saw in our phase 1 and phase 2 sampling. Okay, so I mentioned a little bit some of the national efforts that have been going on related to ethylene oxide. We've had several conversations with US EPA folks as well as other states that are investigating this same issue. There is a network of monitors across the nation that have been utilized as part of this study. All these monitors are monitoring ambient air and specifically measuring the concentration of ETO in the ambient air. Interestingly, these monitors are both in rural and urban areas. I believe one is in the middle of a national wildlife preserve. And what we're seeing from all of these monitors is elevated levels of ethylene oxide. So clearly there's other things that are contributing to the emissions of ETO beyond just industry that uses it. Part of this investigation is to determine what is causing this, and then the best way to be able to address it. So Michigan has been collaborating with other folks from other departments as well as the US EPA on this review and initiative. And there's going to be a lot more to come as we get into the weeds and the data to figure out what in particular could be causing the ETO emissions. Okay, so next steps for us. EGLE staff have committed to doing initial sampling after the facility has stopped their sterilization process. Most likely that will be in March of next year. So we want to put Summa canisters around the facility again after they have shut down all medical sterilization processes to see if there are changes in the concentration of ETO off-site. As well at a state level, but also at a federal level, we continue to refine the ways that we evaluate ethylene oxide. There's been a lot of work to put together the instruments that are used to measure ethylene oxide. The accepted health screening levels for ETO is very low. We do not currently have any instrumentation that can measure down to that level. So there's many very smart folks that are working on this issue, as well as what is causing the measurable levels of ETO at pretty much every monitor we've looked at across the nation. So I would really want to impart on all of you tonight. We've got many folks across the nation that are working on this issue right now. I was at a national conference yesterday in Washington, D.C., talking about this with other states that have medical sterilizers and are looking at the same things that we are. So I'm encouraged to know that there's a lot of other smart folks that are putting their brain power together to tackle some of these challenges that we have right now in evaluating ethylene oxide emissions. As well, we would also like to be able to measure ethylene oxide in real time. One of the limitations that we have with Summa canisters is the Summa canister is drawing for 24 hours. So essentially when we bring that can out to do sampling, we're trying to pick a point downwind of the facility where we're going to hopefully see the maximum impacts. We open up that can and we let it draw in ambient air for 24 hours. But then we have to wait for the delay between when we close the can and then send it to the laboratory for analysis. So there's quite a significant delay between when we pull the sample and we get the results back. One thing we would really want to be able to do is have some sort of device that's able to measure ethylene oxide in real time. We take that monitor out, turn it on, stick it in the air, and we see a measurement. We don't have that right now. We're working towards that as well. As well, our toxicologists have been looking into a lot of the particulars of the persistence of ethylene oxide in the environment, additional health impacts that maybe we don't know about right now. So there's a lot of work related to the health studies and some of those things and how ethylene oxide interacts with the general population. So more work needs to be done on this as well. And with that, I'll introduce Laura to come up from MDHHS.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Laura Abington, and I'm an epidemiologist with MDHHS. And we recently conducted a cancer incidence review in this area, so I'm just here tonight to talk to you about that, how it was done, and what the results of that were. So I'll go ahead and get started. So I guess just a little bit of an overview. Ethylene oxide has been shown in some of the scientific literature to be associated with the following cancers: leukemia, Hodgkin lymphoma, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, breast cancer, and multiple myeloma. So the goal of this cancer incidence review was really to answer the question, are there more cancers in the area surrounding Viant than we would expect to see when we compare them to county and state rates? So we looked at these types of cancers that were associated with ethylene oxide in the scientific literature, and we looked at the number of cancer cases that were reported in that area, and we compared them to the number that we would expect to see in that area if the area had the same cancer rates as Kent County as a whole or as the state of Michigan as a whole. So we basically took the state of Michigan cancer rates and Kent County cancer rates and applied those to the age and sex specific population estimates to this area's age and sex adjustment to calculate an expected rate. And I'll go over that in a little bit more detail here in just a minute. Oh, a cancer rate is the number of cancer cases divided by that population. So this is the analysis area. The shaded region, that orange region, and then this sort of dark pink region in the middle are that's the estimated potential exposure area based on air modeling data. So the cancer incidence review used census tracts as the sort of unit of analysis because we don't have population estimates for the exact boundary of the air model exposure area. So we have to use areas where we do have population estimates for. So in that case, it was census tracts. We chose census tracts for the analysis area if at least half of the tract overlap the estimated exposure area. So this map shows in the purple region the estimated cancer risk of one additional cancer in 10,000 people, and that light orange area around the outside shows the estimated cancer risk of one cancer in 100,000 people. And the census tracts, which are the black lines, are the census tracts that were included in this analysis because at least half of the census tract, half or more of that census tract overlapped with the estimated exposure area based on the model data. Okay, so I'm going to show you a graphical version of this in just a minute, but I want to talk about this table in a little bit of detail here. So this is the table that we use to calculate whether or not we're seeing more cancer cases than we would expect to see in the area. If you look at this, so on the left-hand side, that first column there, you see the types of cancer we evaluated. In the next column over there, you see the observed number of cancer cases in that census tract area. So this is all 10 census tracts combined. And the observed number are the number of cancer cases that were actually occurred in that area during the time period of analysis, which was 2001 through 2015. That's the earliest year that cancer data is available at the census tract level. So these diagnoses were based off residential address. So every time someone is diagnosed with a primary invasive cancer, the independent laboratory or the doctor's office or the hospital or whomever diagnosed that will report that cancer to a national cancer registry, to the Michigan Cancer Registry, and they'll record the person's address at time of diagnosis, age, sex, race. I think that there's probably something I'm forgetting there, but they'll record some basic information about that. So what we use is the address at time of diagnosis to determine if it's going to be included in that observed number of cases. The expected number of cases, that next column over, is the number of cases that we would expect to see in that area if that census tract area had the same cancer rates as the population we're comparing it to. So for this Kent County comparison, if you look at that first column for female breast cancer, I'll just use that as an example. There were 177 observed cases of female breast cancer in this 10 census tract area during the time period 2001 through 2015. If the 10 census tract area had the same cancer rates as Kent County, we would expect to see 219 cases based on the age and sex structure of the county. If this area had the same cancer rates as state of Michigan, we would expect to see 202 cases. And this column here that says SIR, that's the standardized incidence ratio. So if you take the observed number of cases and divide it by the expected number of cases, you get a ratio, and that ratio is called the SIR. If the ratio is above 1, we say that that is more cancer cases than we would expect to see. If it's below 1, we say that's less, but we also have to take into account the uncertainty. And that's what these 95% confidence intervals are for. So this is sort of a measure of uncertainty. So if you look at that same female breast cancer example that I was just showing you, you'll see the number in parentheses there in the SIR column in the shaded box are 0.71 to 0.91. So that means that the uncertainty in there places this estimate in, 95% of the time we would expect to see this number in between 0.71 and 0.91 given the current data. So after we went through all of these, the results were showing that for female breast cancer, the 10 census tract area had less female breast cancer cases than expected when compared to Kent County and when compared to the state of Michigan. And those are shaded because that 95% confidence interval does not overlap 1. So that means that we expect that this number is truly below 1, or truly less cancer cases than we would expect to see. For multiple myeloma, if you look at that shaded box there, the standardized incidence ratio is 1.47, so that's above 1. And that box is shaded because the confidence interval there, the number inside parentheses, goes from 1.02 to 2.06. So since that entire range is above 1, we say that this estimate is most likely truly above 1, probably within a range of 1.02 to 2.06, but our best point estimate is 1.47. So I'm going to show you this in a graphical form next. Here it is graphed out. So you can see the top is compared to Kent County, and then we have compared to state of Michigan underneath that for each type of cancer. The dot shows our point estimates, and that solid line that goes down the middle is our 1 mark. So if you look where the point estimate is, and then there's that bar on each side of it, that's our sort of range of uncertainty, or our 95% confidence interval. If that confidence interval is overlapping 1, so if it's overlapping that bar, that means that the difference, we can't say for sure that there's a true difference there because there's too much uncertainty there. The estimate could be anywhere within that range. So you can see that this top one, for female breast cancer compared to Kent County, that very top one, you'll see that the bar is completely to the left of, the range of uncertainty is completely to the left of this 1.0 mark. So we say that that one is probably truly less than 1, truly less cancer cases than we would expect to see. Whereas if you look at multiple myeloma compared to Kent County, maybe I should get out the pointer here. That might be easier, huh? This one right here, multiple myeloma, you can see that the range of uncertainty is just barely to the left of that line. So we say that 95% of the time, based on our data, this point estimate would fall within this range. So we say that that one's most likely truly greater than expected. So the results here were that female breast, just to kind of sum this all up, female breast cancer we had less cases than we would expect in this area compared to Kent County in the state of Michigan. For multiple myeloma, we had more cases than we would expect compared to Kent County, but when we compare it to the state of Michigan, there was actually no statistical difference. This bar here overlaps the 1. Okay, there's some important limitations of this data that we should point out. First of all, this data is based on surveillance data and not epidemiological research. So there's no individual level exposure measurement. We can't measure exposure in any of these cancer cases. We don't know whether they were exposed or not. Latency periods is the next limitation. So cancer can sometimes take decades to develop in people. So an exposure that happened a long time ago might have something to do with cancer that happens a long time down the road, and we don't know where people were living a long time ago or what they were exposed to. Migration of people into and out of an area also limits our interpretation. So if the cancer is recorded as someone's residential address at the time they were diagnosed, and that is whether they moved there a week ago or whether they've been living there their entire life. We don't know how long they had been exposed or what they had been exposed to. Likewise, people that had lived their entire life in that area and maybe just moved out a week ago and moved to California may have been diagnosed in California. So migration of people into and out of an area really does limit some of this interpretation. Data years are combined because of a small number of cancer cases in the area. So in order to get a really good statistic, we need quite a few cancer cases to be able to calculate a statistic with any precision. And there's just some of these estimates, if you look at that table I just showed you, the numbers are pretty small. And so we had to combine multiple years together to try and get the best precision possible so we don't see any temporal trends. Census tract boundaries approximate the area of estimated exposure, but they don't exactly align with the area. So on that map I showed you, you notice the census tracts were sometimes just a little bit outside the actual estimated exposure area. There's not an exact alignment there, but we have to use some sort of boundary that the Census Bureau has estimates for. So we did our best to approximate the area, but it's not perfect. Air sample data available for verification of the model was, gathered from a limited area around the facility. So the farther out into the Grand Rapids area we go, the less data we have. We don't know how fluctuations in temperature, barometric pressure, wind direction, any of that, especially historically over the last 30 years, we just don't know how that might have affected the exposure. We don't have data from, 20 years ago to let us know what the exposure was like. So this is really just assuming, constant exposure over this time. And then the last limitation I want to talk about is that there's around 31,000 people in this area. And if you look at the cancer risk estimates, the estimates were around 1 in 10,000 people or 1 in 100,000 people. So given that there's only 31,000 people in the area roughly, and the estimated cancer risks are 1 in 10,000 or 1 in 100,000, we wouldn't expect probably to see enough additional cases of cancer in this area to be able to truly affect those statistics and be able to show us something that's statistically significant. So these are just some limitations that we've been seeing. So just to kind of summarize this data, multiple myeloma cases were slightly higher than expected when compared to Kent County, but not when compared to the state of Michigan. Female breast cancer cases were slightly lower than expected when compared to both the county and the state. Hodgkin and non-Hodgkin lymphoma and leukemia did not show any statistical difference from expected numbers, keeping in mind the wide confidence intervals. And then this report is a descriptive review of cancer incidence, and we really can't link any cancer in this area to any environmental conditions, and that's mostly because we don't have individual level exposure information. So all we have is population level data. It's very comprehensive cancer data. They do record every cancer that's, diagnosed in this area, but we don't know how long those people lived here for, what they were exposed to over their lifetime, and that sort of thing. So what we can really say from this report is we can answer the question, are cancers in this area higher or lower than we would expect compared to Kent County and compared to the state of Michigan? So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff, and can answer questions later.
Thank you, Laura. My name is Jeff Rathlin. I work for the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. Sorry, I'm still used to saying MDEQ. Air Quality Division. I work in the enforcement unit. This one? It's not, it's going forward. There we go. Okay. To lay the groundwork for the draft consent order, I want to talk to you a little bit about what is involved in the escalated enforcement process. Escalated enforcement occurs when the district cites a facility for violations and the company is unable to come into compliance in a timely manner. They escalate those violations to us for enforcement. The enforcement process is executed through a voluntary administrative process where the AQD and the company attempt to reach an agreement on how the company will achieve compliance. Compliance is implemented through an administrative consent order. The consent order typically contains a description of all the violations, a compliance plan, a settlement amount or penalty, and then stipulated fines, which are to address any possible future non-compliance with the consent order. Viant was escalated to enforcement due to the nature of the violations and because the company could not demonstrate ongoing compliance with their permit requirements. There were additional concerns that the emissions of ethylene oxide were not in compliance with state toxics rules and could be causing an immediate health impact. AQD utilized modeling that included specific emissions data and facility characteristics to determine the impacts of ethylene oxide within the community and around the facility. And along with that, as Chris mentioned, we also looked at the 24-hour sampling on a near Viant's property. So what were some of the milestones? Early on, we had an enforcement notice letter was sent to the company on January 4th of 2019, and that was to request a meeting to initiate enforcement negotiations to resolve those alleged violations. On February 4th of 2019, we met with company representatives to discuss the enforcement process and to talk about a compliance plan to address their violations. On September 18th of this year, the company agreed to the terms and conditions of the consent order to resolve all outstanding state and federal air quality violations. So the consent order resolves all outstanding violations through the implementation of the compliance plan. Once the company achieves and maintains compliance with the consent order, the AQD considers those violations to have been resolved. So what is an administrative consent order? A consent order is a contract between the state and the company. Once we reach that agreement on that contract, we are required to hold a 30-day comment period. That's required by statute. And then we will hold a public hearing if requested, typically, but as in this case, when we believe that a hearing is likely to be requested, we go ahead and schedule it. Once the comment period ends, at the end of that, we will review all comments that we receive on the consent order, and then we will prepare what's called a response to comments document. That document will be posted online and shared with all interested parties along with the company. Now, that response to comments document will include an explanation regarding any changes that are made to that consent order, which will have been based on the comments we received tonight, if that happens. The consent order becomes effective once it's been signed by all the parties. So when we finish the 30-day comment period, and we've reviewed your comments, and we prepared that document, the next step is to have the company sign the document, and the AG's office has to sign it, and then finally our division director. On the date that the division director signs that consent order, it becomes effective. So I want to talk a little bit about what's in the consent order. So the consent order it includes a compliance plan that requires the company to monitor ethylene oxide emissions around the facility on a monthly basis. So they're doing that through the end of through February because they will discontinue use of ethylene oxide at the end of this year, and then they'll have to use it one more time in January. In January, they have to calibrate the equipment one time per FDA requirements before they permanently shut it down. Then they'll remove all ethylene oxide from the facility, and they will no longer purchase ethylene oxide for this location. In addition to shutting down the process, the company has agreed to pay a penalty of $110,000, which will be paid to the state of Michigan's general fund. Before I get to the last point here, I want to talk about the consent order, because we believe this consent order is beneficial for both the community and the company. Again, we were able to reach agreement in a timely manner on a compliance plan that requires the company to minimize ethylene oxide emissions through process changes that helps to better capture and control those emissions, and at the same time it minimizes ethylene oxide emissions in the community. Once the sterilization processes are completely shut down, they will no longer be emitting ethylene oxide from this facility. The company, as stated before, will conduct that monthly sampling, and the reason for doing that is to demonstrate that the impacts from the ethylene oxide emissions are not increasing. And so far what we've seen with the sampling, it's not increasing. That's what we expected. Additionally, allowing the company to continue their sterilization through the end of the year will allow the company to complete sterilization as needed to maintain supply demands for the medical instruments that are sterilized at this facility. And at the same time, it allows them time to transition their customers to other sterilization facilities across the country. To do that, their customers have to obtain necessary certification that is required by FDA prior to moving to a different sterilization facility. And now that last bullet point, this is one of the key items regarding this draft consent order. It includes stipulated fines, which can be assessed up to $10,000 per violation per day for any future noncompliance. An example of this is, what if they don't stop sterilizing at the end of this year? Now, they've assured us this should not happen, and we do not expect it to happen, but if for some reason they do have to continue, they will be subject to stipulated fines, which could be as high as $10,000 for each day beyond December 31st that this sterilization process is operated. And the only way that I think that this could happen is if one of their customers was unable to get their certification to move to a different sterilization facility. But again, they've assured us that they believe this can happen. So how was that penalty calculated? A settlement amount is determined by AQD enforcement staff, and it follows EPA's penalty policy, where we take into account various factors such as the type of violations that need to be resolved, the length of time the company was in violation, the toxicity of the pollutants that were being emitted, and the possible harm to the environment. Once the appropriate factors have been determined, an initial penalty or settlement amount is calculated, and that initial penalty is offered to the company. And at that point, it is then open for negotiations. Factors such as litigation risk and the company's willingness to cooperate to resolve the violations, and in this case, the company's agreement to shut down the sterilization process, were all taken into account in determining the final settlement amount. Now I'm going to talk real quickly about the enforcement hearing that's to follow our Q&A session tonight. So once we reach an agreement on a consent order with the company, the next step, as I said, is to hold the 30-day comment period and then hold a hearing as needed. Tonight, the hearing will follow our question and answer session. The hearing is to allow all interested parties to provide statements on the official record regarding the consent order. During the hearing, the decision maker cannot answer any questions at the time. The decision maker is here to listen to your comments and so that she can have a better understanding of your concerns on the contents of the consent order. If you have any questions during the hearing, staff's going to be available out in the hallway to answer your questions. And that's all I have for now.
All right, so Malcolm and Sam, hopefully you guys, if you have any questions written down, remember on your colored cards, feel free to hold them up in the air and Malcolm and Sam will come and gather them up for you. If you don't have any questions written down, that's okay too. So we would open this up to verbal question and answers, and I know we have a lot of inquisitive people here, so hopefully, did you have a question, sir, that you had written down? Okay, if you want to give it to Sam or Malcolm, they can bring it up here and I will read it out. Yes, you did. Okay. All right, so the first question that we have, and this is going to be probably to you, Chris. So does everyone that processes or sterilizes medical equipment release ethylene oxide into the environment? If so, how are they allowed to operate?
I would, I guess, first state that anyone that is doing medical sterilization and uses ethylene oxide as part of their process has been required to get an air permit with the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy Air Quality Division. So we do have a full listing of sources that have been permitted in the past. There's many hospitals that have utilized ethylene oxide as part of their sterilization. What we've seen as far as the industry response to the concerns with ethylene oxide is many of the hospitals are now eliminating medical sterilization at their facilities. So don't know of any other options. There's very specific pieces of equipment, medical devices that need to have ethylene oxide used as part of the sterilization, in particular plastics. So such things as pacemakers, which obviously are important to human health and folks that need those equipment. They need to have ethylene oxide used in order to sterilize the plastics in the device. So that is why ETO is used right now, and I am not aware of any alternatives that are available to industry to do that type of sterilization.
So Sam has a gentleman that would like to make, to add some information to some of the things that we've been talking about. So if you want to stand up and do that, she'll hold the microphone for you.
Okay. I'm George McBain. I'm a chemistry professor at GVSU, and I was part of the GVSU group that's been evaluating these ethylene oxide risks for GVSU folks. At the end of Chris's presentation, he said one of the things that needed to be evaluated was how long the ethylene oxide was likely to persist in the environment. And I agree with that, but there are some things we do know about it, both from a chemistry standpoint and from a previous measurement standpoint, and I wanted to point them out so that people in the audience would know. We all hear a lot about both lead in the environment and PFAS nowadays, and both of those are persistent toxins. Once they're out there, they stay there for a long time, decades. Ethylene oxide is not like that. So if ethylene oxide just gets out into the atmosphere, it survives for a few months. If it's in the soil, it survives for a few weeks. If it's in water, it survives for a few days. If you were to drink water that had a little bit of ethylene oxide in it, in your stomach, it would survive only a few seconds. So while it is carcinogenic, and that's what's generating all of this activity, it's not something that sticks around for years. And so once the company stops importing it into the Grand Rapids area, we should expect what's here to diminish fairly quickly over the course of at most a few months. So it's not something that stays in the environment like lead or like PFAS. If people are interested in seeing the actual measurements and reports, I mean, there's a paper on environmental fate of ethylene oxide that I took this information from. If people are interested in reading that paper, I'm happy to provide a reference and a copy so that they'll see where I got the information I'm describing.
Okay.
Because you had said this was something that needed to be studied, and I wanted to let people know that we do know some things about it already.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
It's always fabulous to have a chemistry professor at one of our hearings, so thank you for adding
Come
that.
anytime. So this is a great question, and I realize that we actually did not say this number when you guys were talking earlier. So the question is, what is the level of ETO in micrograms per cubic meter that we're looking at? What is our screening level?
So the level that we're using as our analysis is 0.003 micrograms per cubic meter.
Okay, so let me see here. So this is a great question about Viant's processes, so hopefully you can answer this one, Chris. So why is ethylene oxide released as a fugitive and not going through the smokestacks at the facility?
Sure. So what we've seen with the Viant facility in particular is, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of plastics involved with these medical devices that they sterilize. So the piece of equipment is in the sterilizer, ethylene oxide is introduced into the sterilizer, it does its job, but that plastic absorbs at least a portion of this ethylene oxide into the plastic material. What we've seen is this plastic will off-gas that ethylene oxide for up to 24 hours or even longer, which is long after that equipment has left the sterilizer itself. The sterilizers themselves are very well controlled. They are air pollution control equipment that are used to reduce the ethylene oxide emissions from the sterilizers. But what we've seen at the Viant site is once that equipment is moved out of the sterilizer and packaged up and on its way to wherever its final destination is, it's still off-gassing in the facility. So the fugitive emissions, we think, are coming from this off-gassing of material that's already been sterilized. And those fugitive emissions are not being controlled by the scrubbers, the air pollution control equipment at the site. So they are going out any ventilation systems, open doorways, open windows, and they're not being controlled like the ethylene oxide emissions inside the sterilizer.
I just want to add to that, though. As part of our negotiations for the consent order, we did negotiate with the company to, as part of their steps in their process, to keep the sterilized equipment in the sterilization chambers or aeration rooms a little bit longer so that they can capture more of those off gases. That's why we've seen a little bit more of a reduction in fugitive emissions from the facility.
So that was a process
that was-
change they actually made.
That was part of the process change that they made. There was another process change they made that they just eliminated that step in their process because it also had fugitive emissions associated with it.
And so, Chris, this is another one that I'm going to give to you, and I'm not sure how thoroughly you'll be able to answer it. But the question is, can you speculate on what the sources of ETO are nationwide? Besides sterilizers, I'm assuming is what they're asking. So I think this is something that's been up for a lot of discussion lately, and I think you talked a little bit about what we don't quite know yet. But if you want to maybe elaborate a little bit more.
Yeah, I don't really know how much I'd be able to elaborate. We do have some folks from EPA in the audience as well. I don't know if you wanted to take a stab at that. I guess what I would say from what we've seen is it's prevalent in almost every area where we've got a monitor that's measuring it. So one would want to think, well, what is common to all these different monitors? Clearly, there's not a medical sterilizer on every corner in the United States. So we suspect that it's probably some sort of combustion, maybe related to vehicle traffic. But there really is not any conclusive results yet of what we've been able to determine.
So does anyone else have any cards with questions written on, or do you have a question that you'd like to ask verbally? Just raise your hand and I'll get a microphone. This lady over here would like to ask a question, Sam.
So I attended the previous meeting, and at that meeting they talked about lifetime exposure, and when they defined lifetime exposure, it was 70 years old. Now, EO, ethylene oxide, is a known carcinogen since the 70s. Shell made a comment that in 1981 that their major carcinogen concern is ethylene oxide. This plant has been operating with ethylene oxide, I believe, and this is what I need clarification of, since it moved in, which was in 86, I believe.
It's about 30 years. They've been
And knowing that they were using a carcinogen, a human carcinogen, it was known to be a mutagen since 1948. But my question is this. When they talk about the lifetime exposure being to age 70, but when the figures are 76 and 0.38 units and these really high units, is it still 70?
So I don't know, Yusuf, you want to answer her question or at least elaborate on some of that information?
Yeah, I think the 70-year component in that 0.003 screening level is where we start to have concerns. We don't yet know the individual risk for a person, if that's, it happens at 50 years or 30 years or 70 years. It really is that mathematical, theoretical, that's the level where we start to see concerns, and we have to do steps like these escalated enforcements and look at the company further. I think to use it to say we have an individual risk at that point is the next level, and I don't think we have that information. It's purely a decision making of what steps do we need to look at this situation further.
And that was at 0.002 that determination was made, and it's been 150 plus beyond that. So we're going to make a conclusion here that it's probably more dangerous than, because I think when you say age 70, people go, oh, that's a long time from now. I'm not going to be here for 70 years and not be that concerned. And I do think there should be a concern. And the other question is to you, Chris, because it is a concern that it's high everywhere, right? It's being detected everywhere. And so that is of concern. But these tanks themselves, because it's so highly flammable, and this is used in thermobaric bombs, right? So it's the next level to nuclear bombs that Durbin and Duckworth introduced a bill to put this under the auspices of the Department of Homeland Security as a potential terrorist threat or spot, target, I guess is the right word. So I think while the overall it's the higher levels are concerned, when it's concentrated in another area, it isn't just a health concern. It's an immediate risk because it basically pushes air at 14. It spreads at like 1,400 times normal, and it gets in your lungs and it blows it up. It blows your lungs up, and we wouldn't. That's why we'd like the tanks. Get rid of that's why those concentrated areas are so concerned.
Are
It's
you
immediate.
asking about, so once they're done sterilizing, are the tanks going to stay or are the tanks going to go? So our
Yeah.
impression is that the tanks are also going to go, or they'll be empty. There won't be anything in them. There won't be ETO in the tanks at all anymore because they won't have a reason for it. They won't be using it.
Or they've been using it for 30 years and haven't told anybody. I know who's going to monitor it beyond that. That's all. As far as a community, there's a lot of trust factors that we're trying to deal with, and one of them is it would be preferable to get rid of the tank because then we know they can't use it.
Yeah, and I would really want to impress upon you, we appreciate your patience and the collaboration that we've had with the health departments and local officials as well on this. So we're hearing fully from all of you the concerns. I've gotten a lot of those phone calls from concerned folks that have kids going to school at GVSU. The facility is still going to be monitored and inspected by us after they stop this medical sterilization. There's still other air permitting things that we look at, so we will be inspecting them even after January or February of next year. We'll be monitoring this situation, and I can assure you that if they were to begin medical sterilization and they're not being full disclosure telling us that they're doing that, we're going to find out. So we have, as part of our field operations, routine, unannounced inspections at facilities. That will continue to be the case at Viant.
So does anyone else have a question that they would like to ask? Yeah, right here, Sam.
What's the logic behind leaving the tanks in place if they're not going to be used for any sort of manufacturing processes? It seems as if that's just going to be a liability that's eventually going to be a burden to the public, socializing corporate costs again while privatizing profits.
So have we even heard, have they said that they want to keep them? I don't think they've made a comment either way, so.
It's not been discussed.
Yeah.
It's not been discussed during the discussion on the consent order. Again, they said once they're done calibrating the chambers, then they will stop. They will get rid of all ETO on site. They will no longer purchase any more ETO. I'm not aware of the tanks. I mean, that's something I'd have to ask the district staff about. Do they have storage tanks for ETO?
So Jeff, actually, the field inspector is in our audience, so she's going to address that question because I
Okay,
think she has a little more information. April, can you just stand up, please, and introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is April Lazaro, and I'm the district inspector for the Viant facility. So I have maybe some more specific knowledge about the operations there, and to do a little bit of additional explanation on this conversation with regard to these tanks. So many of you may or may not have seen a keg of beer, which is an aluminum style tank that is pressurized because the liquid is inside and it's under pressure. I would liken an ethylene oxide containing tank to a keg of beer in that it is a kind of similar style of tank that is containing compressed liquid, ethylene oxide, and then they use it as it becomes a gaseous form once it comes out of its compressed state. So we're not talking about massive tanks within the facility containing ethylene oxide that cannot be removed. These are tanks that they are continuously using, emptying, and rotating out. Once they are emptied, they're sent back to be refilled. And I don't know their specific dimensions, but they're about
explains
that
a lot.
size.
That explains a lot.
So, yeah, less than a 55-gallon drum, or roughly that size.
So Sam, could you get her question, please? Oh, hold on 1 second. Let her get the.
To the one that's buried in the ground. If that company closes and somebody else purchases, then they're gonna be stuck with the tab getting that tank out of the ground. That tank needs to go when that company quits using that stuff. It's gonna be like hazardous waste to get it out of there. They're gonna have to do it safely because they can explode. When the bicycle factory was on fire over here, they had every fire department in the city over here because they were afraid that fire was gonna make that tank explode. It would have took out the whole west side. That tank needs to go out of the ground. Granted, ones they can put out a truck and take somewhere else. We're talking about the one in the ground.
So what we can do with that is, because our air quality division doesn't handle tank stuff, it's a little bit different, but we do have a unit of the department that does. So we'll make sure that we pass on that information and just make sure that they're aware of the concerns, because we may not have understood what that question was, because I think we are all under the consideration of that it was those more portable type tanks. So we'll definitely pass that information on and sort of close a loop on that and try to get some information back to you. I know you signed in because I asked you, or probably 5 of us asked you if you signed in. But we know you signed in. You might have even been like number 5 on the list. So just make sure that you see Heidi over here she has her fall coat on today. So maybe she can just write a little note by your names so that we know to get that information back to you. Does that sound good? And then Sam, you have another question behind you. I think that's Carol.
I appreciate the information on the fine and how it was derived. Given that this is a billion-dollar company, somehow $110,000 that just goes to the general fund in the state of Michigan seems very insufficient. Is there any way in which money can be obtained to help the local neighborhood? This is a federally designated neighborhood for its poverty and its crime. It has a crime organizer. It has other people who work with the community. I mean, they could use more community help. They could use more health fairs. They could use more, obviously the reputation of the area has also been affected. And so is there any way in which the local community can be helped?
Yeah, Jeff definitely talked about that.
Right. We did talk with the company about potential supplemental environmental project, and that's where they would propose a project where it would benefit the community. And they did not come up with something. What they came up with initially was shutting down the facility, shutting down the sterilization process. That's not a supplemental environmental project under our policy. We asked if they had any other ideas, and at the time, they were not able to come up with anything. And in terms of trying to finish negotiations, resolve this, and move forward, they accepted a penalty. And that's what we negotiated, was the $110,000.
So I think the short of that is that they weren't willing to negotiate any supplemental environmental projects, which are going to be something that would take the place of some of those penalties that they would pay instead. So in this case, and we've talked about this a little bit, but one of our main concerns with this facility was getting them to legally be bound to stop sterilizing. And so once we had that agreement and then the other things, the continued testing and the shutting down of the equipment itself, those were the 2 most important things that we thought would actually, not that money and other projects wouldn't benefit the community, but more immediately these 2 things would benefit the community in general. So, and we can, you're Carol, right? Okay, I thought you were, I'm sorry. I didn't want to just say that out loud. Hey, Carol. But you might want to just talk to Janine after out in the lobby. She's right behind you here with the black sweater on, and she might be able to talk a little bit more specifically about some of that information. I think it might be easier just a one-on-one conversation. So we had a question over here. Malcolm, can you come get this gentleman in the plaid? Do you get extra points for asking a question tonight? I just was
No,
wondering.
but I hope so
What?
now.
You should.
I had a question on if Viant has other locations that do medical sterilization in other places.
That's a great question. Do they have other that do medical sterilization?
I'm not sure if Viant, I know they don't in Michigan. I believe that they're a very big corporation, so I would imagine they do, but I don't know that for sure. I would mention, as part of our investigation with medical sterilizers, we've looked at other facilities across the state as well, specifically sources that are subject to the same federal regulation that Viant is. So we have done some investigating at other facilities that do similar work, and are kind of using the same approach to analyze the emissions and assess any kind of concerns related to that. But I'm not sure if Viant has anything else in Michigan or anything else in the country.
So of those other, the medical sterilization places that you assessed, what's the difference between what they're doing and, what Viant did?
So first and foremost, Viant is the biggest one. They use the most ethylene oxide as part of their process. The other contributing factor, though, is what I mentioned before, the fugitive emissions. So what we've seen with other facilities is better control on those fugitive emissions, whether it's having the building where they're storing this equipment after it's been sterilized, keeping that under negative pressure, or minimizing the amount of ethylene oxide that's being released uncontrolled, through ventilation systems or whatever else. So those two factors made Viant, again, like I mentioned on the NATA list, the #1 source of concern in Michigan.
Anyone else have any questions that they would like to ask? Written or verbal? Going once, going twice. I'm not an auctioneer, my husband is. Oh, good, we've got one, yes. I want to make sure we use all our time up. So this will be good, okay. And I apologize if I misread anyone's handwriting, so. Okay, so this is the first question, and you did talk about this a little bit, Chris, but this is, what are the ambient levels of ethylene oxide? It was mentioned this testing is being performed, however, data was not presented. So can you talk a little bit about some of the, I think they're talking about the national sort of ambient air testing that they're doing for ETO as far as what we know and what we don't know right now?
There's a lot we don't know. What we do know is that we're seeing similar levels across the nation. So, in fact, even pretty similar to what we've seen more off-site from Viant here in Grand Rapids as well. There are persistent low levels that are above the screening levels, and it's, again, still being investigated to figure out exactly what's causing it. But there's been pretty consistent numbers, and again, like I mentioned, in urban and rural areas as well.
So this is this is a multi-part card. So there's these go in order. So these are great questions, whoever gave them. So this is, and we didn't talk about this, so I'm going to make sure you kind of talk a little bit about this. So how were the new limits for ethylene oxide established if the current technologies can't detect that lower limit? So talk about how the screening level was changed or what the impetus of that was.
So I'm not a toxicologist, and I probably am not going to be able to explain this as thoroughly as one of our toxicologists could, but essentially there was medical studies done looking at folks that work in the medical sterilization industry, and considering the exposure levels that they had. Based upon these medical studies, there was significant evidence to indicate that we had significantly underestimated the toxicity of ethylene oxide. So the studies, there has to be a large set of evidence for EPA to take actions such as this to revise and reduce the health screening level. So EPA did that based upon these medical studies, and Michigan was able to review the research and what EPA had used to conclude revising their screening levels. We agreed with the evidence and followed suit and changed our screening levels as well here in Michigan.
So when we talk about a screening level, typically that's not something that we go out and take a Summa canister and test. That's not how it works. The screening level is something that we look at through our air modeling and our toxics program through permitting, and it's more, I wouldn't say conceptual, but it's not with a canister. It's not a direct sample, so it's a little bit different. So when this second part of that question is, why would we pick a screening level that we can't test down to? That's a great question. So the technology to test for ethylene oxide is continually getting better. So even since we did our first phase 1 samples, the technology to get down to those lower levels has gotten better. So they're continuing to work on that. There's another part of this question that was, so if we have these ambient levels or these background levels, why is that not just the standard? Well, typically it's because, as we saw even on some of the maps, and probably outside it's a little bit clearer, even some of the locations where we sampled for ethylene oxide that were away from Viant, we still saw levels that were above the detection limits of the lab and that were above screening levels. So we have that screening level to be health protective, and then we have what we sampled. So we can't take those ambient levels and try to equalize them. We know that it's more important, or those more restrictive screening levels are more important for us to make sure that the health and the public are protected. So I get where you're going with that question. It would be nice if we could measure a level and say, well, it's standardized across the nation, let's just pick that, but it's not how it works. So there's one more question on this one. So sterilization is a fraction of the industries that utilize ethylene oxide, which is true. So have we considered other factors that contribute to the data captured by the Summa canisters, or other processes or facilities that would use ETO maybe at smaller increments? So can you talk a little bit maybe about what we looked at with our Michigan air emissions reporting data when we sort of looked at the sources of ETO in our state?
Yeah, so I guess I would say that we're actively investigating any sources where there potentially could be ethylene oxide emissions. We've become acutely aware of the very low levels that can be emitted where there potentially are concerns with the screening levels and emissions impacting the surrounding community. So there's a lot of industry that uses ethylene oxide as part of their manufacturing. And at a national level, I would say that there are efforts underway right now to revise some of the federal regulations that apply to these types of industry, such as chemical manufacturing. But here in Michigan, we have started to broaden our scope on what we're investigating outside of the medical community. I think we've got a pretty good grasp of the medical sterilizers in the state and any facility that uses ethylene oxide for medical sterilization. But when we get into the manufacturing industry and other businesses that use ethylene oxide, we have a lot of work to do in that area still. So many folks in the air quality division here in Michigan are aware of our efforts. If we get permit applications that come in-house where ethylene oxide is mentioned as either a direct material used in the process, or even if it's a trace emission as a result of reactions, we're doing a very thorough review. We're bringing in a lot of folks to take a look at those facilities and assess emissions. So I expect there's going to be other sources, but it's hard to say who and when and what kind of emissions they may have.
So I think what Chris wants to definitely reiterate is that we wanted to look at those large sources that we saw first, the ones that were of the highest concern. And then we're we wanted to spend our efforts there, and then we are taking a look at all of the, I guess, smaller actors that might be contributing to these other levels. So it is definitely an important thing. It's a great question. Any other questions? Because we're getting close to the time to start the formal hearing, so I want to make sure. So Carol has one more question. Carol, can you stand up, please?
Do we know if Viant will continue in business as they shut down the medical sterilization portion of their business?
Yeah, that's our understanding, that they're going to continue to operate the processes next door.
Okay.
And I don't know exactly what those are.
Do we know if the businesses, the manufacturing, whatever they're going to be doing in the future, if that poses a risk to the community that's around it?
So I would maybe talk a little bit about how the permitting process works and how new equipment is looked at by Air Quality Division.
So I guess I would answer directly and say we don't expect there to be any ethylene oxide emissions related to the other activities at the facility. So if they have other processes that they do at the facility, they need to go through our permitting process to be reviewed for any emissions associated with it. But we don't expect any ethylene oxide emissions from anything else at the facility outside of the sterilization.
From you.
Correct.
So what Carol said, let me just repeat the question. So what Carol asked was, so if they have any other chemicals that they use or any other things that would be of concern, this would be something that we would look at through the permitting process.
Correct. Yes. Yes.
Yep. And then Sam, you have one more question behind you.
So you talk about this permitting process. In ethylene oxide, it was required to be, it was on the permitted list, or the list of that need to be. Is every chemical that's used and emitted need to be reported to you?
I will tell you that we have a list that's always expanding of the chemicals that we need to evaluate. We have so Michigan is one of the states that has a dedicated toxics program, which is not the case with every state in the United States. So be thankful that we do. We do have a very extensive list of toxics that we evaluate if a permit comes in-house that lists that as an emission. So when I talked about our modeling analysis, that's a computer-generated model that we look at to assess impacts for any toxic that may be emitted from the site, and we address it appropriately through throughput limits on what materials they can use, the height of the stack that the emission comes out of, the type of air pollution control equipment they need to utilize to control that toxic. There's a very long list of options we have to try to address that and limit it in a permit, and then ensure that we're protecting public health when we permit and allow them to do it.
And so one thing just to add to that too is that if a company comes in with a new process and a new permit, they do have to be transparent about everything that they're emitting. They're not allowed to hold things back or not tell us about things or not reveal certain things that they may be emitting. So it is something that we get a comprehensive list of, and we are able to evaluate. Even if it's not on our toxic air contaminants list, they still have to give us that information, and it's still something that we look at. So I know you had a follow-up, but I just wanted to clarify that.
I do. One is a comment. As you know, Michael Hawkinson with the Chicago Tribune has been doing investigative reporting on ethylene oxide facilities around the country, and he comments that we're fortunate in Michigan because we do have a decent program in place. But when you talk about the permitting, can you share that with neighbors? Because this has been 30 years that this plant has been here, and we didn't know about this. What else don't we know about? And can you share with neighbors so we at least know what we're being exposed to?
Yeah, I mean, so we do have a lot more tools now than we certainly did 30 years ago. It's a lot easier for us to share information, and we have a lot of things on the web. I am happy to sit down and walk you through how you can find out what is around you. We do have that available. 30 years ago, you're right. No, we did not have that. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have email. I mean, I come from that generation where my kids go, what? You had a phone hooked to the wall? That's so weird. But we do have that now, and it might be hard to find if you're not familiar with it. So I can give you my card. Like I said, I would be happy to sit down with you and kind of show you where some of those tools are, because we have as much online as we possibly can give you, and sometimes maybe it's overwhelming information. So all of us, I hope that you guys will find that we are resources for you. Please call and ask us questions. We don't want the community to be in the dark about things. It's definitely one of the main reasons why we're here tonight, is not just to update you on things, but also so that you know who we are and you can hopefully feel comfortable giving us a call. I don't always stand behind a podium sometimes, but so we do need to break now so that we can get ready for the hearing at 7:30. So remember, just as a reminder, the hearing, you will, if you want to make a comment, and remember that's where we don't respond to your comment, you will want to fill out one of these white cards with your name and information, mark that you would like to make a comment. You can give your cards to Sam. Malcolm, can you raise your hand? Did he just walk out? He left us. He's not doing his job, shirking his duties here. So Malcolm and Sam will collect your cards. They'll give them to me. We will have to read a formal hearing statement, and then we'll start taking comments on the record, and I will read your names in the order that they came in. And then after we get through everyone's cards, if people still want to make more comments, they can. All right, so we're going to break until 7:30. And I do have to read a formal statement to you all, so I would ask for your patience while I do that. I don't have one. I'm lame. Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jennifer Dixon, and I am with the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, furthermore known as EGLE. I will be serving as the hearing officer for this public hearing on a draft administrative consent order, furthermore called Draft Consent Order for Viant Medical, Inc., located in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Seated at the table is Mary Ann Dolahanty, Division Director of EGLE's Air Quality Division, who is the decision maker for this administrative consent order. In addition, staff from all agencies are available outside of the hearing room to answer any questions you may have regarding this project. The Air Quality Division is responsible for regulating sources of air pollutants to minimize adverse impacts on human health and the environment. The law governing these responsibilities is Part 55 of the Natural Resources and Environmental Protection Act. We are here tonight to receive your comments on the draft consent order. The purpose of tonight's hearing is to give anyone interested in the draft consent order for Viant an opportunity to provide information the Air Quality Division can use in deciding whether to approve the consent order as written or if there are additional issues to be considered. Please recognize that EGLE can only use the information you provide if it relates to the criteria EGLE must use in making a decision. For example, concerns related to local zoning, truck traffic, and noise are not within EGLE's authority. In addition, some of you may want to express your support or opposition to the draft consent order. We will be happy to make note of your position, but please understand that EGLE is, by law, not allowed to base our decision on whether there is widespread support or opposition to the enforcement action. Please note the proposed terms of the draft consent order are brought to you tonight in the form of a draft agreement. This does not mean the division has already made a decision. Instead, it reflects an initial agreement in which the company must pay a monetary penalty, do monthly ethylene oxide sampling, cease sterilization by the end of 2019, and agrees to additional penalties if compliance is not maintained. Everything in the draft consent order remains open for comment and further consideration by the division, and we look forward to your comments on this issue. The hearing is being recorded, and your comments will be part of the information EGLE will consider in making its decision on the draft consent order. The public comment period for the proposed consent order began on September 23, 2019, and will end at midnight on October 25, 2019. Additional information can be submitted until then, and it will be considered when EGLE makes a decision. Additional comments can be submitted to Jeff Rathlin. After the close of the public comment period, the decision maker will review all written and verbal comments received. All significant air quality related comments will be considered, at which point a final decision on the consent order will be made by the decision maker. The decision maker may reject the consent order, approve it as drafted, or approve it with amendments. If approved, the decision must specify which provisions of the draft consent order, if any, have been changed in the final consent order and the reasons for those changes. In all three scenarios, all interested parties, including everyone who was on the original mailing list, anyone who provided comments during the public comment period, and anyone who attended the public hearing will be directly notified of the decision. If you would like to make a comment on the record regarding the draft consent order and you have not done so already, please fill out a white public comment card and hand it to a staff person, either Malcolm or Sam. We will use these cards to call upon those who want to make a statement tonight. When we have gone through all of the cards, I will ask if anyone else would like to make a statement. When your name is called, please come to the microphone and make your statement. If you have written comments or materials you would like to present, please hand them to a staff person as you come to the microphone. As you begin your comments, please state your name and any group or association you may represent. I ask that we all be courteous and do not interrupt the speaker. Please also recognize EGLE staff are here tonight to provide a fair opportunity for you to express your views on the draft consent order and listen to those comments. Thank you so much for your attention. I will now begin calling the names of those who have indicated they would like to make a comment. The first person is Michael Locksterman.
Good evening. First and foremost, thank you for this hearing. It's been very professional, very informative, and I'm quite appreciative for that. One thing, however, that I am not quite appreciative of and I'm very puzzled by is the fine amount that was decided upon. It seems remarkably inadequate, given the 30-plus years of releases that this facility, granted, I understand it's not Viant, but a variety of corporations that have been releasing into the neighborhood, really doesn't quite own up to the potential damages that could have happened. And I am curious why it was only $110,000, given that the company has about $1 billion in revenue. Seems quite inadequate, and I don't know how or why it was come to that, because it seems little more than a corporate indulgence or a slap on the wrist, given the serious nature of this. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your comment, Michael. The next person I'm going to call is Margot Johnson. And that is it for the cards that I have after Margot's done. So if anyone else has a comment, they can please give it to Sam or Heidi or Malcolm, and we'll get you next on the list.
Margot Johnson. I am a neighbor, and I live about 4 blocks from the plant. I walk by it every day. And what I would like to have added to the consent agreement, if possible, is some type of communication set up between the community and the organization, so that as they change processes and potentially introduce chemicals or processes that could be damaging to the neighborhood, that we're made aware of that. In addition, some level of support for the neighborhood that is concerned about, while the study didn't show a lot of cancer risks, there's still concerns. So some type of assistance in organizing the neighbors and responding to their concerns in some manner. And if they can collaborate with the neighborhood in that manner, I think it would be beneficial.
Thank you so much for your comment, Margot. Would anyone like to make a comment at this time? Heidi, can you please check in the lobby and see if there's anyone out there that would like to make a comment? Okay, there's no one out in the lobby that would like to make a comment. Last call for anyone in the room that would like to make a comment. You can go back up to the microphone, Margot. Sure. Thank you.
And in the end, the ultimate agreement we want is that ethylene oxide to stop being used. Do not change that at all in the consent agreement. And if they could remove the tanks, that'd be really nice.
Thank you again for your comment, Margot. Does anyone else have a comment that they would like to add? Okay, so I'm going to read the closing statement. This is just a reminder that the comment period will stay open until October 25th at midnight. So if you'd like to submit additional comments in writing, you can do so before you leave tonight and give them to a staff person, or you can submit them via email. So thank you for your comments and cooperation tonight. We appreciate your interest in the draft consent order for Viant, as well as the time you took to be here. As indicated at the beginning of the hearing, the public comment period ends on October 25th, 2019. All interested parties, anyone who provided comments during the public comment period, and anyone who attended this public hearing will be directly notified of the final decision on this proposed draft consent order. The hearing is now closed. Thank you very much. So at this time, the hearing is closed, but we do have the room until 9 p.m. So if there are additional questions that we could answer for you, if anyone's thought of any other questions, I think it would probably be easier if we either talked as a group here, because it's a lot smaller now that a lot of people have left, or if you'd like to go out into the lobby and talk one-on-one with folks, we'll definitely stay around. We don't want you guys to miss this opportunity to ask questions or answer them. Does anyone have any questions in the room just for now? Was that like a maybe I have a question, but okay, nope, you're just scratching your head. All right, I got you. That's all good. I do that too sometimes, or I'll be like, oh. Okay, sure. Yeah, you might as well. You're like old hat at this mic thing, Margot.
I'm obsessing. But through this whole process, and I know that you're, there is a process that's been dictated, right? But it's almost like the neighbors have to prove that this is a problem and that it's impacting their health. And it shouldn't be that way. It should be prevention as opposed to letting someone go in with, ethylene oxide, and then we have to say, hey, wait a minute, I'm really worried. The process somehow at the state level, even though you guys do better than other states, if it can become a preventive type arrangement as opposed to a reactive type arrangement that is dictated and on the burden of the victims, basically, in this particular case, I would like to participate in trying to make something like that happen, and am absolutely interested in, because you probably know better than anybody what type of improvements could be made to the process so that we're preventing things as opposed to trying to shut things down. Okay?
Yeah, I appreciate that comment, and I don't know if anyone else would like to answer that. I mean, Marianne is here. I'll turn your mic on, Marianne, so you can chat. There you go. Sure. You're live now.
All right, thank you.
But you make sure you talk into it.
All right, thank you for that comment. Does this come up?
Here, why don't you use mine?
Yeah, let me use yours. That way I don't have to bend down. What's that?
That'll be easier.
Oh, that's true. I could do that.
Then we'll never get it out of her hand.
I'll try and keep it short then. Thank you for that comment, because I do appreciate it. And what I guess I want to say is the process that we go through, I would actually say that it is preventative. The company was permitted several years ago, 15, 20 years ago, or however they've been operating. And during the time that the permit was evaluated, staff at the state level through Air Quality Division did evaluate all of the materials that were being used at that facility, and in issuing the permit at that time, deemed that if they met the limits that were in the permit at that time, that they would comply with all state and federal regs, again, designed to be protective of public health. What changed here is, I believe it was in 2016, when new science became available that said, and at the time, remember, we knew that ethylene oxide was a carcinogen. Probable carcinogen. We know that there are other carcinogens that are in the environment that we evaluate and we do permit from a risk management perspective. So we have data that says if limited to this amount, then that's a minimal risk and an acceptable risk, and facilities can move forward. Gasoline, for example, every time you pump gas into your car, you're getting exposed to quite a few different carcinogens. Benzene is one of them. So we did know that, and we set limits at that time that were deemed to be protective. But then again, in 2016, as more studies and more science as science evolves, we learn more, and we take action at that time. And I think that's what happened here, is that evaluation that was initially done with the Viant operations was no longer adequate. And so we needed to take action to do something to assure that the new health standard, the much lower health standard, given that new data, was directly applicable to this facility. So I hear what you're saying, and I do wish that we knew everything at all times, but it's not possible. We know what we know at the time, and we're constantly in a state of learning and following science and following the data that's out there. So does that help kind of put it in perspective?
Oh, wait for the microphone, Margot. You got Malcolm right here, too. Either way.
Oh, you had a microphone.
Yeah, he was waiting for you, but
Yeah,
you're too fast.
He knew so, if the neighborhood had known 15 years ago when they were permitted that they had this carcinogen there, and it was known back then, I think we would feel better about that. At least we're warned, and maybe we could even participate and say, I think there's a problem at the plant. But also, one thing that I heard at the last meeting when I talked to some of the, I think you had
Yep.
epidemiologists at least here at the last
Yeah,
one.
we do here too. I mean, they're the Department of Health and Human Services
Okay.
folks. So Yost is a toxicologist and Laura is an epidemiologist. So
And so here we are, a highly dense neighborhood, right? Lots of neighbors. Unlike PFAS, this plant was put in the middle of a neighborhood, knowing what the risks were to the neighbors. Unlike PFAS, where it was put out in the country and people eventually built out there and it impacted them. So, and we have lots of those little industries in our neighborhood. And you may be monitoring them, but what I heard at the last meeting is, here's this silo of chemical, and here's this silo of chemical that you're watching, and here's this silo of chemicals, but what happens to the porridge when you put them all together? And that's of a concern.
Right.
So, and I don't think that, and what I've been, and I try to research and look it up ahead of time, and I was told it isn't done, and I haven't been able to find an answer different to that in any of the research I've done.
Right. So what you're referring to is the ability to conduct, say, a cumulative impact of all emissions or all pollutants that may be coming from a single industry or from multiple facilities. And we share that as well, and we would like to move the regulations in that direction so that we can be looking at that cumulative impact. It's not done right now. It's not provided for in statute, but even more importantly, I think from a science perspective, how would one do that? So we challenge ourselves every day, and we're looking at, within the department, we have a group that's been working on trying to evaluate how we might do that, how we might look at cumulative risks. There are a few instances where we will look at things that may be cumulative. I might get too technical here, but with regard to, say, criteria pollutants, so our nitrogen oxides, carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, particulate matter. We do look at those from a cumulative perspective. It's the air toxics that I think we have sort of a lack of data in order to be able to do that. We don't have a lot of monitors in the ambient air that are monitoring air toxics. We would like to see more, and we'd like to move ourselves in that direction. And hopefully we're going to get there with as science evolves and as resources become available so that we can do that. I mean, it's very important. I don't disagree with you, and I recognize that there are some limitations to the evaluations that we're doing. It is difficult from a cumulative. So what are you combining, and what are you looking for, and what are you then comparing against to determine what is acceptable and what is not? We don't necessarily have answers to all of those questions, but I think we're aware of them, and we're moving ourselves, although in small steps, we're moving ourselves in that direction.
So Malcolm, you had a question.
Yep, we have another question over here.
Yep.
Yeah, so I'm going to piggyback off of what Margot was just saying, and this is something that I think can benefit all of us as citizens and concerned community members. Is there tends to be a lack of communication between what you guys would like to see happen and what we can do to help you make that happen, because your hands are kind of tied in a certain way, right? You're bound by what the legislator allows for you guys to do and the funding that's passed and all of that. And I know that in the past it's been an issue with people wanting to speak up and say, hey, this is what I'd like to see because I work in this department, right? So how does that conversation happen so that we can help push our legislators and our government officials and our local elected officials to give you the support that you need so that you can give us the support that we need? In addition to that, I think that Margot's comment on having this be more, we really are being kind of reactive in a lot of these instances. There's thousands of chemicals that are currently not regulated. And most of us don't know how to find that information out, where to find it. A lot of these businesses have particular, I don't want to say gag orders, but they have particular things so that they don't have to disclose everything because it's a part of their process or a part of their product, and it would put their their particular thing at risk, right? If they were to disclose certain information. So where do we get to the point, rather than saying we don't have the information or it wasn't a set standard, to everything needs to be tested? And I know that's based on capacity and funding and stuff like that too, but how do we get to that point where we have all of these things and we have science around all of them before they're allowed to be used?
That's a big question. And I think it's a great question. And I think this kind of a forum allows us to hear your concerns and allows us then to bring them forward. When your legislators have, coffee hours or open hours, come and talk to them about what your concerns are. Those are great opportunities. I know our director had, I believe she was or did some meetings around the state. Look for those. We try and put press releases out. We try and put information out when we're in an area so that we can have those community meetings and we can have feedback from concerned public. So those are areas where your voice is heard and you can raise some of these concerns. And as far as availability of data, there is quite a bit of data out there. It's
maybe too much sometimes.
Maybe too much, yeah. But there is a lot of data out there. I mean, EPA maintains several databases based on monitoring networks. They maintain databases based on emissions that are reported and quality assured through the state agencies and then reported up through EPA. So there's quite a bit of information on specific sources that is available publicly.
And they do community webinars a lot of times.
Yeah.
Excuse me, to explain how do you look at this data? So, for instance, just thinking about the NADA data or the NADA data, whatever way you do it. I say NADA data, I don't know.
NADA data.
But
Yeah,
when
me
you're
too.
looking at that, even for me looking at that, working in air quality for, over 20 years, I say, how do I read this? What should I get out of this? What is this actually telling me? So they do offer a lot of times webinars that are geared towards the public, geared towards people that don't understand the jargon and that don't know how to read those. And they're actually very valuable. I've sat on a couple just to kind of say, like, I don't really get this, so I would like to learn a little bit more. So that's another way that we're trying to reach out. Again, I think there's always these barriers to how do we reach everyone with everything because we don't know necessarily what Margot wants to know. We don't know what Michael wants to know. We don't know these things specifically about people, so we kind of have to sometimes information dump on people and hope that you'll ask us if you need clarifying questions. But I agree with Marianne, like making yourself available if possible, and everyone's busy, to those times when your legislators are in your community and voicing your opinions, and that helps us be able to make the changes that we want to make.
Okay, we have a follow-up.
So hold on one second, Margot. I just, because you talked a lot. Does anybody else have any other questions? Otherwise, we're going to give the mic back to Margot for a second. Anyone? You guys good? All right.
So I just helped my granddaughter with a leaf project for school. And in the entire state of Michigan, these urban foresters have taken a map that you can blow way up, and they put down a dot for every street tree, and if you click on it, you can find out what kind of tree it is, what the address is, a lot of information about the tree. If you took every business within Grand Rapids and plucked a little dot on it and said, this is what they're using, and this is what, and maybe you do that, but that would be helpful, because if we can blow it up and go, oh, this is my neighborhood, let me click on that and click on this, and and then have it refer you to another resource that might be able to explain it in English.
Right,
So.
yes, and that might be part of it. Now, so I saw Heidi, and I'll comment on that in a second, but I saw Heidi standing here with our 2018 air quality report.
A program called Environmental Mapper. And it does map all the sites of contamination, and it has some different layers of environmental data. Air data is not on that, but it's called Environmental Mapper if you want to Google that. And
It's
for the
not
whole
the most
state.
user-friendly, but it does have valuable information.
It does
on
have
it.
a lot of information, a lot of layers in that statewide.
My thought is there's like
Yeah, EPA does have
Yep.
that database too. Yeah, April will find it
Yep,
for you.
April's gonna find it, but Heidi, so you're holding our air quality, our report, so that's what I was pointing at you for, not so that you would have to answer a question. I apologize, it was confusing. So she's holding, yeah, so we have this, which is information about all of the air monitors in the state, and it basically talks about what do they monitor, what did we find, what were trends. So it's might be a heavy read for some people, but it does have a lot of really good information, and it kind of shows you where all the air monitors are in the state. We do have that available online as well. We also have a map with all of the air monitors where you can look at what are they measuring for. Some of that data is real time, some of it is not real time. Some of it's more like the Summa canisters where we have to go collect it and they have to send it to a lab. But that's also a good resource, and we do have some out at the table over there, so if you're interested in that, feel free to grab it. So what is it called, April? Echo. Yeah, April, can you get the microphone?
Water information as well.
So you said eco.epa.gov?
Yep, ECHO .epa.gov. And if you were to search for EPA Echo database, that's also going to bring it up. But I wondered if it was mobile friendly, because we know often things like that aren't, it's a little bit tricky when you're zooming in on the map, but it does have little icons on there that we can see. And I'll just randomly click on one, which just happened to be the city of Grand Rapids on Freeman Street. So let's see. So it doesn't, this is for, also has RCRA information. So this is, it's got lots of information. And this is telling me, do they have recent enforcement? No. Driving directions, days since last inspection. So it really is a wealth of information to find data on companies that are across the street or around you just by looking at the map.
So good.
Thank you, April.
Thank you. So does anyone else have any other questions? Okay. Malcolm will run over to you, or you guys can meet in the middle. How about that?
I was just wondering if the air quality releases that companies have to file with you guys, are those protected by NDAs, or are those available for public viewing somewhere else?
So when you're talking about a release, what do you mean exactly? Can you elaborate on that? Or are you talking about emissions, or are you talking about upsets?
The emission, can't remember the word right now, the emissions that they have to file with you guys, the permits.
Yep,
the
so
emission permits?
it's all public. It's all public information, and it's all actually available on our website. So again, if you're very, very interested in that, I'm happy to point you exactly where it is. But otherwise, if you went to michigan.gov/air and you search for Michigan Air Emissions Reporting System, or MERS, you can click on that and look by facility what air emissions they reported. And yeah, the AQD source information page is a cumbersome resource to use, but it's also a very good resource in that when you open it, so if you were interested in finding out what inspection reports, stack test results, enforcement actions, violation notices, other things like that, we post all of that on our website, and it's sorted in multiple different ways. The issue comes in is when you get to that facility, and permits, all their permits and major source and minor source permits are on there as well. The issue is once you get to that and you click on it, it will give you like a laundry list of these file names that look very crazy, and that's because there are file names and we get them. So there's also like a key on the first page of what those file names mean. But again, it is a very good resource for information. So for instance, if you wanted to see Viant's latest inspection report, you could go to that source information page, which we actually link on it from our Viant website, which is michigan.gov/Viant. So we tried to put all of that information very easy for everybody to find. Not every facility has a specific web page associated with it, but that one does. So, but it is a little cumbersome. So let's say you get there and you say, Jennifer, I don't know what I'm looking at. Please call me and I will help you. Just give me a call and I can walk you through what you're looking for. And I'll tell you exactly where it is. Don't waste your time. I was going to say something, messing around, trying to figure it out, because you don't need to know that. You know, we have a lot of resources that can help you. So, Malcolm, she had another question here.
So MSDS sheets, SDS sheets, and I think you had mentioned RCRA, which there's some streamlining that's trying to happen so that everybody's following the same standard, but those do have air quality information on them for the products. Is it for the products themselves, or is it for their manufacturing process as well?
So the SDS is going to be what materials are they using in their process. So it might not even be, you know, what's on the SDS might not be even what's being emitted. It just depends on what the process is. And as far as RCRA is melding into that, I don't really know. Do you know? I'm not sure what you're referring to. We don't handle RCRA stuff, so it's not in my purview. I'm sorry. But the SDSs and MSDSs, anything that would be submitted with a permit application that we would have, we don't necessarily post all the applications online because they can be hundreds of pages sometimes, but they are available through FOIA. So if you are interested in that, that's, you know, fairly easy to get. Any other questions? Oh, sorry.
To the office at any
Yes.
time that you want to sit down and look at a file.
Yep.
It's totally free. Just want to call and make an appointment and let us know, and we'll
Yep.
have it all ready for you in a private space to go through.
Yep, so I don't know, just to make sure that everyone heard that, April said that if you're really interested in a facility, you can come down to the Grand Rapids District Office and they'll call ahead, make an appointment, is what she reiterated, and you can sit down and go through that file at your leisure in the office.
Someone will be there to help
Yep.
answer questions
Yep.
if you compile questions as you go through.
So if nothing else, hopefully you got some resources out of this, Margot, right? Okay, she's nodding. Good, good. Any other questions? David, I see you looking like you have questions. Just kidding. No, he doesn't. I'm looking at him because he told me earlier, I couldn't hear you, Jennifer, and I was trying to be quiet because normally I'm really loud. So any other questions for us tonight? Got a little bit of a captive audience here, so, you know. Well, we really, 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 really appreciate you guys spending the time and coming out. We feel that this is very important. This has been a priority for us since last year. We, you know, staff, as you can see, have been diligently working on this pretty much daily. It's been a big deal for the Air Quality Division and for the department in general. So we really appreciate you guys all coming out. We will be hanging out there for a little bit longer. If you have any questions on your way out, please feel free to grab someone and ask. So thank you so much.